and for being a part of the Wellness Weekend. And Harley's going to come and give us our second session. We are trying to record these, so after the fact, if you want to go back and if you missed something, you want to listen to it again, you want to share it with a friend that you think it might be helpful in their life, and that would be good. But ultimately, I want us to take in so we can give out. All right, so let's begin to process these things and allow God to use these things. So Harley, you come and you get into our second session here.
If you will, turn to 1 Kings 19, and let's finish up our morning together today. Appreciate you coming out. It's a step of faith when, who is this guy? Where is he from? I guess the pastor probably knows him, and I guess we'll trust his judgment, but I appreciate you being here today. 1 Kings 19, and we're going to look at the familiar story of the prophet as he navigated some challenges in his life and some things we can learn from that. This has been a rich text for me over the years, and to continue to learn things from it. Hope you will as well. 1 Kings 19. Let's read verses 1 to 4. 1 Kings 19, 1 to 4. So we're looking at in our second session, experiencing God's renewal in our burnout. So this would be probably stress over a lengthy period of time where it will take us, and you may be in a season of burnout, or you know someone who is. And like I said, we will kind of at least touch on a few things as it relates to depression. One of the things I always navigate in these weekends is, and I try just to ask the pastor, and then some of you answered the questionnaires, that helps me. But there's so many things with our emotional, mental health, and that we won't have a lot of time this weekend to spend on depression, but we'll touch on a few of that today. So experiencing God's renewal and burnout. 1 Kings 19:1, and Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. So this is right after Mount Carmel and the fire falling from heaven, burning up the sacrifice. They killed the prophets of Baal. And with all how he had slain all the prophets with the sword, then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, so let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he arose, went for his life, came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat under a juniper tree, and requested for himself that he might die, and said, it is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my father. So we're looking at today experiencing God's renewal in burnout. This next slide is so this is, you know how we leave reviews for things? This is the review on TripAdvisor for the Garden Tomb. I was just there a year and a half ago. Only gets 4.5 stars, okay? It's good, but it could have been better, okay? Like, how do you not give a 5 stars to the Garden Tomb? Now, we can debate whether that's actually where Jesus was buried. We won't get into that today. But how do you rate it as 4.5 stars? Isn't it interesting, no matter what happens, often our expectations of how others will respond to it doesn't necessarily go as we had in our minds? Have you ever thought about what Elijah thought was going to happen after the fire? Fire falls from heaven and devours the sacrifice and the stones and the water. I think Elijah thought that full-blown revival was going to happen, that the nation was going to fully, with all of their hearts and lungs and lives, they were going to turn back to the one true God. And that does not happen. Jezebel is still in power, Ahab is still in power, and now they're coming after him. And so we see him flatlining, if you will, emotionally, the burnout that he heads into. The guy who calls down fire from heaven in chapter 17 is experiencing burnout in chapter 19. And so we see this really swing of a pendulum that we all are subject to. And if Elijah could be burned out, then you and I can be burned out. And so we need to first admit that we can go there and ask God to help us learn some lessons. Now, I want to give you just a little, and I'll give you the resource at the end, but from a little booklet on burnout, this would be a description of what we're talking about. Because one of the things I've noticed in our ranks is we throw out depression, schizo, we throw out these labels like we know what they mean, and a lot of that's more our view of it or our vantage point on it. And so I want to be careful to define the term burnout. I think this is the best way to capture it. So somebody put it this way: burnout is more than fatigue. When you're tired, a 3-day weekend will improve your life, but when you're experiencing burnout, an extra day of rest won't cut through the darkness. Burnout is more than too much stress. When you're stressed, completing a project or getting past a deadline creates a sense of relief or satisfaction. But when you're experiencing burnout, milestones don't satisfy like they did before. They get lost in the continual onslaught of next. Depression comes closer to capturing the experience of burnout, but depression is merely the absence of hope. And while it often involves isolation, it does not capture the level of cynicism or rebellious escapism that frequently is associated with burnout. And then he said this, as burnout sets in, each dream and relationship that once promised life seems to be an emotional net loss even as it is being fulfilled. So it's almost like the things that we look to for energy, to excite us, to renew us, that those same wells we used to dip into and receive refreshment and renewal, it does nothing for us. That's what we're talking about in this area of burnout and talking about how we can be renewed with the Lord's help. All right, so let's talk about 2 ways that we need to let God get involved in our burnout. And if you feel like you're teetering on this, where it's hard to get anything that excites you or engages you or someone you know, these are ways that we can let God help us. Number 1, let's talk for a minute about identified symptoms. So first of all, we have to let God help us identify that we're struggling with burnout. Any of you of my generation or older remember going to the bank, literally going to the bank before apps and all the things we have now, scanning checks and mobile payments and all of that. And you remember as a kid going to the bank, like if dad or mom were going to the bank, you went to the bank with mom or dad or grandparent, right? And you would make sure, I remember this clearly, like you pull into the bank and you would make sure that the back windows were down, okay? And back when you rolled down the windows, okay? My boys several years ago were like, Dad, why do you say roll down the windows? Like there hasn't been a car made since they've been born that you don't just push the little button. And so you'd make sure the windows are down. Why? Because if the teller knew there were kids in the car, you got what? Yeah, exactly. Dum-dum, something like that. And so you were identifying to her, there are kids in this car. Do you know when we're in the car, if you will, of burnout, that often the last person to know that we're burned out is the one who is burned out? Like when you're living in it, it's very hard to identify it. And so what we need is God to come in. And I don't think Elijah he thinks the problem is Baal. He thinks the problem is Jezebel. He thinks the problem is everybody but him. And so when we're in this funk, if you will, called burnout, we need God to identify it for us. And this will look like a lot of different, God can use all kinds of ways of doing that. He may use your spouse. My wife is the opposite. If you think of a doormat wife, my wife is on the other end of the spectrum, okay? She will call me on everything. She sees it coming a mile away. And so sometimes it may be our spouse. It could be in a church setting, a staff or a deacon. It could be someone else that just says, hey, you're not in a good place in this area. And so we need to be open to God giving us that feedback where we're trending in that direction. All right, so let me give you 2 things that God identifies here in the text that were issues for Elijah. Number 1, allow God to identify your fearful stress. So this is where this ties in with our previous session. Allow God to identify, this would be one symptom of being burned out, fearful stress. So there's fear that's driving you where there should be faith. Now I want you to think about Elijah. He had just run off the prophets of Baal, called down fire from heaven, and yet here he is now just a few verses later, scared out of his mind. When fear rules in our lives, when fear always is setting the tone, that often is a symptom of being burned out. And geographically, we kind of read through the verses quickly, but Beersheba would be the most southernmost point in Judah. He goes as far away from the seat of power from Jezebel as possible, and nowhere in the text do we see that God told him to do that. He sees the issue, he responds in fear, and he runs. When we're struggling with burnout, we're always negative. We're always viewing things in worst-case scenarios. Worst-case scenarios is not discernment. Worst-case scenarios is often just fear. Fleshly-oriented, sight-based processing of situations in our lives. And this session will be a little less expositional, a little more practical, or giving you some things that hopefully you can grab onto and walk out with today. Let me give you a few symptoms in this area that often are true of people I'm counseling and I'm reading that are struggling with burnout. These would be things that maybe at least show you're teetering or flirting with being burned out. Number one, little things make you disproportionately emotional. Like if you catch yourself crying over something that otherwise would not move you, or over raging, where your emotions, the best way I can say is you're killing mosquitoes with cannonballs, if you will. You know what I mean? Like you're overreacting to things. I think this would be something to think, am I in that mode? And when I am, probably I'm at least getting close to the burnout. You can't think straight. It's hard to put your thoughts in order about how you think and why you think about this situation. This is a big one. You're becoming increasingly cynical. The cynic. Yeah, I know she said that nice thing to me, but probably she meant this by that. Or, yeah, husband did this or wife did this, but probably behind that is something negative. Being cynical. And there are lots of manifestations of that. Nothing satisfies you. It's never good enough. Even when you're in a good moment, it could have been better. Lastly, number 5, you're self-medicating. And that doesn't have to be an illicit drug. It could just be something that numbs your mind. The average American spends 4 hours a day on their phone. I think if I understood the studies right, that's 15 years of our lives at the current pace we're going to spend on our phones. Doesn't have to be pornography. Doesn't have to be the worst things in the world. Just numbing our minds. Are you doing that? And do you see others doing that? And do you recognize that some, if not most of that, could be just trying to find something to numb us to where we're at in this area of burnout? So fear is a key feeder or issue as it relates to burnout. Pride makes us overextend ourselves, and then fear keeps us from admitting it. Or we blame something or someone else. And so we need to root out of our hearts and lives this fearful way of processing it. It kind of be like when we were kids. Remember when you get lost? What do you do when you get lost? You drive faster, you walk faster. And typically, especially when you're a kid, you walk further and further away from your parents, that you didn't pay attention where they were. The same thing is true with burnout. The further we go to try to fix on our own with fear, the further we get from the solution or the antidote that will help us with it. Now, I want you to notice one little word found in verse 3. It says, and when he saw that, he arose and went for his life. And if you mark your Bible, I would circle that word saw. In verse 3, Elijah is not walking by faith. He's walking by what? Sight. You will never overcome burnout, and you'll never help someone else do the same if you only base your decisions on what you can see. A sight-based response to it will always lead to a wrong direction. We have to walk by faith, including when we're in seasons of burnout. All right, verse 4. At the end of the verse, he says, he requested for himself that he might die and said, it is enough, O Lord, take away my life. All right, number 2, allow God to identify your numb stress, N-U-M-B. When you become numb, you can't feel. That often is a key indicator that burnout is on the horizon. A pastor friend of mine was having a conversation with his wife. I think this was after Easter this year. It was just an interesting dialogue, and his wife, who, like some wives, is out doing something during the main service, she just said, how'd it go? She was talking to her pastor, her husband, how'd the service go? And her husband was kind of giving her some feedback on the service. And he said that, it went well. He said as he responded, he said, sometimes, he said, as it relates to preaching, the win is just enjoying Jesus in front of people, which I thought was very interesting, that to him, preaching is just feeling something strongly about God, feeling something strongly about Jesus, and just letting that show in his preaching. One of the things I've noticed when we get burned out is one of the greatest losses of burnout is that we don't feel anything much about God. We don't feel much about his love. We don't feel much about his joy, his peace. We lack the ability to worship and to praise him because we've allowed this burnout to affect our worship and our relationship with God himself. And so here we have Elijah. He's at the end of his rope. He just, God, I have nothing left. Take my life. We see this spirit that's creeping into his heart. All right, let me give you a few symptoms of being numb. All right, number one, your passion fades. So things that you used to be passionate about, you could take or leave them. A specific food. I mean, this could be just anything. Something that used to be a passion that no longer is. Maybe it's a hobby, a relationship. Number two, you no longer feel the highs and the lows. Like when people are excited, you're just not. And when they're really down, you still feel nothing. You're just kind of flatline. That's the profile of this thing called burnout. Number three, everybody drains you. Like to be around people is just, you'd rather not because they just take from you what you don't already have. So relationships are where they once were life-giving, they're now draining. Number four, your productivity is dropping. So like at work, in the home, in the settings that you're producing something, your productivity is dropping. And then fifthly, this one may seem random, but I think it's very important. You don't laugh anymore. Like humor is lost on you. One of the things I use, those that have trained me and taught me, and I'm still learning from, I use humor a lot in my counseling. At least I think I'm funny. But I use it not for comic relief, but to watch how a person responds to it. Even if it's in a couple's counseling, if the husband says something or the wife says something that objectively is humorous and the other person gives nothing, that's often just the tip of the iceberg, that there's something more going on. So if your sense of humor is either lacking or different, that often shows that something is off in the emotional health of yourself or another. So burnout occurs when we begin to live as if caring is the enemy. And I would rather feel nothing than to feel anything. It's just less work. It's less exhausting. And so we end up closing off. And one thought I would have, maybe because this is the Saturday session, but those that are around you and maybe even come to church here tomorrow that may feel a bit aloof or antisocial even, there's always something more to that. Same in your family, in your neighborhood, that recluse neighbor that never talks to anybody. That's not random. There's something behind that, and this could be a part of that or something else contributing to it. And so learning to see through that, the numbness, the lack of emotional or passionate responses. Now, I'd say lastly on this, and we'll move to our second point, apathy is the enemy. And apathy often feeds on burnout. If I were to say to you, what is the opposite of love? The temptation or the tendency would be, we would say hate, right? Like hate is the opposite of love. No, apathy is the opposite of love. I tell couples this regularly. If you guys will at least fight, we can work with fighting. But if you say, whatever, I'm done, I'm out, there's no way forward on that. And so burnout kills everything and everyone we influence. And if I can't feel strongly for God, if I can't feel strongly about others, even in a negative way, there's no way forward on that. And so burnout is a key component of either hindering or hurting the relationships that we have with others. So we need God to identify it. The question I would encourage you to ask is, God, where am I trending toward burnout? Where am I becoming numb? Where am I becoming fearful? And letting him, as he does with Elijah, diagnose that issue. I would say most, if not all of us in the room have some issues on this front, maybe even today. At least we're leaning that way. We need to ask God for his help. All right, now, number two. This would be the real practical part. Intervening remedies. Let's talk about what God does to help Elijah with his burnout. You ever heard the expression staging an intervention? You know, maybe to help someone who's addicted and doesn't know it or is in denial or doesn't want to change it. God does that for Elijah in his mercy and in his grace. The thing I love about God is even when we don't care about him, he still cares about us. He feels as strongly about you today, no matter how strongly you feel or don't feel toward him. And because of that, he's always willing to intervene. Sometimes when we don't even want him to. He comes alongside us, and we see him doing that for Elijah. All right, let's talk about a couple of areas in this. Number one, allow God to intervene with your physical deficiencies. So burnout is the result of deficiencies in a couple of different areas. Let's talk first about the physical. And you notice in verse 5 that it says he lay down and slept under a juniper tree. Verse 4 refers to that tree as well. I remember hearing an evangelist a few years ago say this, ask this question, who put the juniper tree there? God, right? years before, God planted this juniper tree, had it right there for this moment. Cue the prophet, cue the sun, cue the shade, and here is Elijah. Can I tell you today, God is so many steps ahead of us that if we will just let him into our lives when we are on empty, he's already full and prepared and ready to meet these needs that we have. I don't know what that juniper tree is in your life, but I'm sure God's already got it there, ready for you, that conversation, that influence, that resource. And we've got to communicate that to others around us as he gives us opportunity. All right, so let's talk about a few things God does physically to help Elijah. Number one, the rest of the body. Elijah needed to sleep. And sleep is such a key part of pushing off or resolving this burnout that we are all prone to. The rest of the body. If you can follow the sequence for just a second, Elijah has just got done calling down fire from heaven after building an altar and pouring a bunch of water over it, chasing the prophets of Baal and killing them with the sword. And then it says in verse 4, after all that, he goes on a day's journey. Nowhere do you read that Elijah sleeps between chapter 18 and chapter 19. So he should have had stop, a rest somewhere there at the end of chapter 18, but instead, because of fear, he just bolts. So he's now 2 days into his reserves. He's on empty, and God knows the first need in his life is physical. It's counterintuitive, but this is so key today. The first thing we have to always address in any area of our well-being is the physical. I'm not saying it's the most important. Obviously, we're a spirit, and the body someday will decompose in the grave. God will glorify it. But if we don't deal with the physical first, we can never get to the emotional and the spiritual. If I'm in a counseling session with someone that I've just read their personal data inventory they filled out for me, or it comes up in the conversation, and they say they haven't slept in a week, there's nothing I'm going to say to them that's even going to make a difference, right? They're a zombie. They're sleep deprived. So we have to, when we're dealing with burnout or any of these issues, anxiety, depression, we've got to first deal with the body. It's going to be an ongoing thing, but we have to address that first. And so God here models that for us. He doesn't give Elijah, here's a sermon, a link to listen to. He doesn't give him something even emotionally. He first deals with the body, and specifically with sleep. Verse 5, it says, and he lay and slept under the juniper tree. Go down, if you will, to verse number 6, into the verse, and laid him down again. So Elijah sleeps, then he sleeps again. We see the rest of the body is being addressed. I don't know how much you've read on sleep, but sleep is something I've been digging into quite a bit because it is such a part of this area of our lives. But in sleep, there are basically 4 cycles. I don't know if you've read on this at all, but you have what is called N1 and N2. Those would be like lighter sleep, where something could wake you up pretty easily. And then you have N3, which is what we call deep sleep. And then what we all need to get to every night, which is REM, R-E-M sleep. So you have those 4 cycles of sleep. And the article I was reading just the other day was talking specifically about why we need to do the REM sleep and how intentional and a part of our well-being that is. The reason they call it REM, R-E-M, is because our eyes actually move when we get to this phase in a rapid manner. And it's a subconscious way, in ways we don't even fully understand yet, of processing things when we reach this deep level of sleep. And what's interesting is when we get to that level, God has wired our bodies. Like, think about how much God has invested to help us sleep right, where we lose muscle toning or the ability to move our arms and legs. The dreams we've had where we jump out of something, or we're falling or whatever, where we really get lost in our sleep, if we could move physically, we could harm ourselves in a lot of different ways. Maybe now and then that has kind of overlapped. But God has wired when our minds get to that level, it actually it hinders us from being able to move physically in demonstrative ways. The reason I mention that is just to say, God wants us to sleep. And he has given into even how we're made these layers of it that I don't even know that we fully appreciate. Sleep is not just a way to pass the 8 hours no one else is up. Sleep is not just about the body resting. There's all kinds of things going on in our being that when we shortcut that, we begin to hollow out our ability and our capacity before the Lord. So we see this repeated thing that God has Elijah do. And it's interesting that it says in verse 6, laid him down again. This was not a one-time nap. I think it was a change in Elijah's habits. Some of us, our issues with burnout is not we need to take a good nap this afternoon or maybe next week get an extra night's sleep over a period of time. We need to change how we sleep every day. It's a change in our habits. And often burnout is the result of sloppy habits, specifically in our rest, that need to be shored up or strengthened or amended. I mentioned this in the first session, but we are designed by God to spend a third of our lives sleeping. Like that bothers me as a type A person. So I'm going to live 90 years if God is very good to me and gracious to me, and I'm going to spend 30 of those sleeping. Like that, what could I do in those 30 years? That's the first thing, or at least shave off 10 of those. And then as I mentioned, and to on top of that, spend 1/7 of our week resting. So God has designed us to rest a large portion of our lives. And every person who chooses to resist that will eventually trend toward burnout, including you and including me. We are not the exception to that. We're not superhuman. We're not bionic. We are biology that God has created for the need of rest. All right, so we need to add those rhythms, tweak those rhythms to be what God wants. All right, now the painful part of our study, because this is a part of it. End of verse 5, it says, after he rests, then he says, arise and eat. Number 2, let's talk for a minute about the diet of the body. So it's both the rest of the body as well as what we're taking into our bodies, how we're managing that diet. This also feeds into burnout. Verse 6, beginning of verse 6, he looked and behold, there was a cake baking on the coals, a cruse of water at his head, and he did eat and drink. Verse 7, end of the verse, and touched him and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. And he arose and did eat and drink. So we see God ministers to his body in rest. Number 2, with food and drink. So God's treatment plan included food and drink, rest, food and drink, rest, over and over. And it's interesting in verse 6 that it says that he laid the cruse of water and the cake bacon. Did you notice that? At his head. Elijah was so weak that God had to take the physical nourishment he needed and put it as close to his mouth as possible. He had reached this point that he needed nourishment so badly that God put it as close as he could to him. Burnout happens in a physical body that lives in a physical world. And so we are foolish to ignore the quality or lack of quality of what we're taking into our bodies. We don't have time to look at it, but in your own time, back in chapter 17, there's the 2 stories of, remember, Elijah's at the brook Cherith, and then you have the widow of Zarephath. Both of them fed Elijah, right? The ravens bring food, right? And then you have the widow giving of her cruse of oil. Do you know all of that gave Elijah the strength he needed physically to build the altar and to pray the prayers and to say what he said to the people, choose a side? And I think Elijah forgot that here. He had failed to take care of his physical well-being, and so God intervenes to help him and meet the needs that he had. Instead of allowing your burnout to shape your view of the physical, allow it to expose where your physical rhythms and diet need to improve. What happens when we get burnt out is the physical world, we let the burnout shape our view of it. Instead of, if I'm burnt out, something's off in how I'm managing the physical. My rest, my diet, we need to evaluate those things with the Lord's help. And as we do so, God will help us improve. This is a hard truth, but I've had to yield to it both in ministry and personally, and even in family. Somebody said this to me years ago. Your life or your ministry or your body, you're getting the exact results for which the systems you have in place are designed. Now, there are things outside of our control physically, right, that we can't manage. But much of the things we're dealing with, specifically in this area, are not just randomly happening to us. We're not being faithful to evaluate our systems, our schedules, our rhythms, to help us be prepared to deal with and to battle burnout. All right, number 2. All right, so hopefully those things help you, and maybe God will give you some specific areas of direction on that. Allow God to intervene with your spiritual deficiencies. So Elijah had some issues physically. He also had some issues spiritually that fed him in this area of burnout. Look at verse number 6 again. Verse 5. And as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, behold, then an angel touched him. Verse 7. And the angel of the Lord came again the second time and touched him. And so burnout is not just physical in nature. I want to be careful to say that. So it's not just we're well fed, we're well rested, and burnout will not occur. Sometimes we can still be burnt out because of spiritual things that need to be resolved. So 2 things. Number 1, the touch of God. We need God to touch us. We see that clearly, that God intimately and tenderly comes alongside Elijah and encourages him with touch. I don't know that we can process how emotionally exhausting what Elijah has just been through must have been. The hate, the resistance, the apathy of those around him. And so God comes and touches him and emotionally encourages him in a way that's meaningful. A lot of what we're dealing with this weekend relates to the soul. We talked about the body a second ago, but it's who we are in the core of our being. And Spurgeon once said this: consider how precious a soul must be when both God and the devil are after it. So, just like the devil's trying to sidetrack Elijah here spiritually and probably trying to do the same in your life today, God, He can touch us on that level. He can steady us. He can soothe us. He can encourage us. He can refresh us. And the temptation when we're burned out is we kind of disassociate from all relationships, right? Like people are just noise, people are just burdens. And one of the tendencies is we also then tend to disassociate from God, right? We're not in His Word because I have nothing. I don't feel anything when I open it up. I don't feel like I have the strength to even open the pages, let alone focus on it. Prayer, man, I don't have the energy for that. And so we have to lean into God when we're most tempted to lean away from Him in seasons of burnout. Pastor I respect said this recently. He had gone through burnout, and he said, God's favorite people to use are the broken ones. Broken people get the point that they realize the poverty within and have to look beyond themselves for renewal and strength. And then he said this about himself: I believe God used me in life and leadership before He broke me during my burnout, but I also believe that now I am more responsive to God because there is less of me. And could it be that the burnout is to purge away and refine away self-reliance, self-dependency, and then to lean into God and ask for His touch and His strength and His power? All right, so the touch of God. And then secondly and lastly, notice verse 7, he says, arise because the journey is too great for thee. Verse 8, and he arose and did eat and drink and went in the, notice this word, strength of that meat for 40 days and 40 nights. Number 2, the strength of God. So the touch of God. Number 2, the strength of God. So like we talked a moment ago, we were out west this past week, and I don't know how you deal with what's in your fridge before you leave for vacation, and then when you leave from where you're staying on vacation. But for us, we try to eat our way out of everything. And the meals get really crazy toward the end, okay? You're eating ice cream for breakfast, and you're combining things you never would eat at the same meal. So we did that both when we left Ohio, and then when we left the Phoenix area or the Utah area where we were staying. And it's interesting here that Elijah, that God says to him, there is a journey that I have you on currently, and I'm about to enlist your help in, that you need my power. And without it, you can't make this journey. Could it be that some, if not most, of our burnout is we're trying to do God's will, whether that's in our homes, our ministries, this community, but we're doing it without tapping into His strength on a regular basis? I think burnout often is just a fruit issue of some root issues in our theology, practically speaking. I'm not passing judgment on all of it. Some of it is physical in nature, is medical in nature. But for most of us, our issues with burnout are we are not relying upon God's strength the way we need to. We're trying to do family, we're trying to do marriage, we're trying to do ministry, and we're trying to do it without the power of God. And so burnout is a gift if we'll view it as just a warning signal, if you will, on the dashboard of our lives saying, hey, we keep flatlining because God's not a part of this. He's not as much a part of this as he should be. So Elijah here, I don't know what he's thinking, but he just called down fire. He probably thinks most of it's on him at this point. And he's trying to go, and he's running out because he's not relying upon God's strength. Now, one of the things I struggle with in the text as we finish today is why did it take him 40 days and 40 nights to get to Horeb? If you know the geography at all, it's only 200 miles. And I've wrestled with this for some time as I've taught on and studied this text. 200 miles would be about halfway to Ohio. I think I drove about 500 miles yesterday, did it in 9 hours, 8.5 hours. Even if you're walking, there's no way that it should have taken him that long to get to Mount Sinai, which is actually the same mountain as Horeb. But I think it describes just what despair he was in. Elijah had to work through some things. And what you're going to read at the end of chapter 19 that we don't have time to study this weekend, God was trying to get him to the end of himself, and it included the wandering. It included all of the side trails and things that he went through emotionally, and he needed the power of God to navigate those, to work through them, to identify them, to let go of them. And so he needed the strength of God for this journey that he was about to go on. One last thought I would say, and I wish I could talk more on this, but burnout can actually be viewed through a positive lens. And I just give you this little thought. Those of us who want to do something for God, we're not content with just being status quo or the average Christian or just settling for whatever happens. If we care strongly about God and his purpose on planet Earth, we're going to always be prone to burnout. That's something I've had to work through. This is a struggle for me. And in one sense, it's always going to be a struggle because I want to see God do something in my life. I want to see God do something in my kids, in our ministry. And if that's you as well, then this is always going to be a tendency. And the key is learning how to process that with God in the equation, letting him in to strengthen you and to renew you when you get into this thing called burnout. All right, let me show you the resource. So this would be a book I would recommend. This is a little booklet. If you can pull that up there. It's called Burnout. Can we advance that slide there, guys? No? You can just write down the title, Burnout, Resting in God's Fairness. It's by Brad Hambrick, is the title there. And Burnout, Resting in God's Fairness. And a few of the quotes that I shared were from that book, but it's a good little, there we go, thank you. It's a good little booklet on just how to navigate burnout, what that looks like, how to process it God's way. In fact, that book, I'll reference something tomorrow. There's a 12-book series. They're all like just little booklets on how the gospel intersects with real-life problems. I recommend all of them. Cutting, like more specific things, self-harm, abusive spouse. It deals with a lot of different things, but they're only maybe 45 pages. They have some discussion questions. I use them in counseling all the time. So if you're looking for resources on any major topic, counseling-wise, those may be of help to you. But that one specifically is really good on burnout. All right, let me show you this little video clip, and I know our time is done. But watch till the end, all right? Hopefully we got the audio. Go ahead. Watch the kid. Isn't that a cute video? Now, here's my question to you. The caption, a friend of mine posted that. I said, this is what it's like in heaven when one sinner repents. You know, the angels rejoice. And here's my question to you as we finish, because here's our struggle with burnout. Since when has anything about our relationship with God and our representation of him, when has it ever been what we're doing? You know what I mean? In one sense, we didn't get saved because of something we did or how long we did it. It's all of grace, right? It's all of dependence upon God, his power, his character, his goodness. And I think where we struggle with burnout, we that. We forget that to get anything across the finish line in our marriages, I want to finish well, don't you? In our ministry with our own kids and grandkids, the only way we're ever going to get anything across that line that brings glory and honor to God is only by His strength and by His power. And Elijah, for a few verses, forgot that. And yet at the end of the chapter, he's back on message. He's getting Elisha queued up to take his place. He's back in the groove of what he's supposed to do and be, because he remembered that it was about God in the first place. His power, His strength, His ability. Burnout is always the result of forgetting that it's all of God. It's all for God. It's all from God. It's all going to end with God. And so I encourage you to let go of burnout by just letting God be more in your life. Rely upon Him. Rest in Him. Lean into Him. Ask for His strength. Ask for His wisdom. Ask for His power. And I trust as we do so, God will use us in the days ahead for His glory. I'll just give you one statement and we'll finish. Live today in a way that will help you thrive tomorrow is the best way I've heard this. Live today in a way that will help you thrive tomorrow. Burnout is just something you deal with on a day-to-day basis. You just try to change your pace, your mindset. Live today in a way that tomorrow you're thriving a bit more than you are today. And I found that to be something that I work at. I can't fix burnout. I'm always battling it myself, to be honest with you. But I can try to today. Be in the moment, stay where I'm supposed to be, and let God, over a sequence of days and months and years, get me and keep me where He wants me to be. All right, any quick questions on that?